Hello, I'm Julie Scanlon and I'm here with Ruth Lewis today, and we are going to be talking about International Women's Day, which is the reason we're doing for this recording. And the UN's theme for International Women's Day 2023 is Digital Innovation and Technology for Gender Equality. And I really wanted to speak with Ruth because some of her recent research really touches on this area. So the UN wants to use the day to celebrate women and girls who are advancing gender equality in the digital space, exploring the digital gender gap. But importantly for our conversation and Ruth's work today, spotlighting women and girls' rights in digital spaces and looking at online and ICT facilitated gender-based violence. So I'm a consultant and trainer in diversity and inclusion, and I specialize around women's inclusion, and I also am an executive coach. I'm just going to ask you, Ruth, to introduce yourself before we make a start.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, so my name's Ruth Lewis, and I'm an associate professor at Northumbria University in social sciences. My background's in sociology, but also criminology and gender studies. And I've done work about gender-based violence sort of all throughout my career. And more recently, as you say, it's been about online or virtual or digital forms of men's violence against women and girls. So we're talking about a grim subject, but it's lovely to be celebrating International Women's Day with you, Julie.
It's brilliant. I'm so looking forward to our conversation, Ruth. So can you tell us a little bit about the book that you have recently co-written?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Digital Gender Sexual Violations, Violence, Technologies and Motivations. And I co-authored it with my lovely colleagues, Matthew Hall and Jeff Hearn, who've also worked on this area for some time. So the book is, as it says, about a range of different sorts of digital harms that are gendered. So we talk about, as well as doing some sort of introductory stuff about the kind of terminology that we use, about the context around what we mean by these digital gender sexual violations. Some of the chapters focus on particular types of violations. So we've got a chapter on online abuse of feminists, and that's actually based around my work with Mike Rowe and Claire Wiper, also at Northumbria University. We've got a chapter about upskirting as a form of homosociality, a chapter on revenge pornography. We should say that, we use quote marks around revenge pornography because the terminology of that has changed, and it's a slightly problematic term to use. And we look at some of the kind of emerging forms, because one of the difficulties with this field is that there are so many different types of digital harms emerging all the time as tech develops. So perpetrators use it to harm women and girls in different ways. And then we also look at sort of what some of the wider implications and responses are. And one area that we look at is employers' responsibilities for their employees who are experiencing or perpetrating online intimate partner violence, which of course can affect the workplace too. So that's kind of the broad scope of the book.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, Ruth, and looking at this topic from kind of a 360-degree angle. I'm really curious as to the title, the words that you've used in the title might not be kind of what we might think of as obvious. Do you want to give us a little bit about what was underneath those choices?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's a relatively new phenomenon emerging over the last 2 or 3 decades.
Okay.
As it emerges, as this often happens, new terms have been developed. So there are loads of different terms to refer to either the whole gamut of digital online violations, or specific elements like kind of cyber harassment or upskirting, for example. And we wanted to find a term that encompassed all of these different behaviours. And some terminology that's been used before kind of forefronts the technology that's being used. So terms like technology facilitated abuse kind of forefronts the tech as if the problem is with the tech, as if it's a problem, you know, caused by technology. Some terms don't forefront the gendered element of it or the sexual element. Yeah. So we played around with looking at different, you know, how you bring all these different words in to create a useful term. And we use the term digital because we're not just talking about online or virtual, we're also talking about things like the Internet of Things, the ability of people to control the heating in your home from a distance, for example. So it could be a form of abuse to you know, for your ex-partner who still has access to control the heating to put your heating up and, you know, increase your electricity bills, for example. Yeah. So digital is a more useful term, more all-encompassing term. And then the terms gender and sex are always complex and difficult, aren't they? There's been loads of debate about the different meaning between gender and sexual. We don't need to go into all of that just now. But sex itself as a word, it's got several different meanings. It can mean your biological sex, the act of sex. Sometimes it's difficult to identify whether a form of abuse is sexual or sexed or gendered. And it might play out in different ways according to whether you forefront the gendered nature or the sexual nature. For example, a slur like "get back in the kitchen," which is quite often used in online abuse, it's clearly gendered because it's based on the belief that women belong in the kitchen and to serve men, but that is also very closely attached with ideas about sex and about sexuality and heteronormativity. So we were trying to encompass all of these complex meanings and implications of the words. And of course, you know, terminology is really important because terminology suggests different sorts of understandings, even different socio-political approaches. You know, I was thinking about, for example, the differences in terminology between talking about climate change and climate crisis. You know, that conveys something quite significant. Or to use a kind of very old-fashioned term, instead of talking about child sexual abuse, to say that somebody's been interfered with. You know, very kind of euphemistic, doesn't really convey what's going on or who's doing what. So we need to be really mindful of terminology, and we've used this this slightly cumbersome term to try to get over some of these problems that I've raised there.
Yeah, it's such an all-encompassing area, and the title does really exemplify that and tries to capture. I had never thought until this moment that the technology kind of in smart homes in terms of like controlling heating could be used as a form of abuse, but of course it can be. But I just never personally thought about that until this second.
And a lot of the online abuse that happens by an ex-partner who has been controlling, or a current partner, sorry, not just ex-partners, but a current or ex-partner. So I think sometimes we tend to think of these digital violations as between strangers or between perhaps you know, people known to each other but not necessarily in an intimate relationship. But a huge amount of intimate partner violence now also happens online.
It's additional tools to create that kind of control and abuse.
Exactly.
Also interested, you mentioned there you have a chapter on upskirting in the book, which is also something perhaps that if people hear about you know, ICT facilitated and digital kind of enabled abuse, wouldn't necessarily think about that. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, what's in that chapter and kind of how you worked around that.
Yeah, sure. So we did a really interesting study actually about how men talk about upskirting. So it was based on data from an upskirting website. So you might not know, and listeners might not know, that there are such things as upskirting websites, I'm afraid, which are websites that are dedicated to hosting images that people, men, almost entirely, have taken of other people, almost entirely women and girls, and then they post up these images, and then there's chat between the men about the images. And what we did was we looked at one of the most, in fact, the most voluminous thread on that website, which has since been closed down. And we analysed the ways that men talk about it. So we looked at the original post and what the original poster said, and then all the comments that run after it. And two themes came out really strongly. One was the theme of homosociality, by which we mean men forming friendships, relationships with each other. And in this case, it was very much about men getting kudos from each other. So there was a lot of men congratulating the original poster, using terms like "sir," "well done, sir," "what a shot," "oh, I could only dream of achieving shots like this, you've really nailed it there." You know, very things that were really crediting the original poster with you know, superb powers of photography and of bravery as well. You know, a lot about you were so brave to get that close to the victims in this case. The other theme that runs through it is what we call craftsmanship. So there was a lot of focus on the technology of it. How did you get such clear shots? What was the lighting you used? What kind of phone were you using? You know, other things that were about the kind of craft of it, if you like. You know, obviously there's been a resurgence in interest in craftsmanship, craftspersonship. Nothing wrong with that at all. But we thought that it was really interesting that there was this combination of craftsmanship, and it is, I'm emphasizing the word man in there because it is about men's craft, and homosociality. And in that, you know, what I expected to see was quite a lot of really vile, explicitly misogynistic comments and posts. And actually we saw relatively little of that. And what we saw instead is what we call polite misogyny, which is, you know, comments which seem to admire the, I'm going to call them victims, the women who were filmed without their knowing and without their consent in the images. So there was quite a lot of admiration of how fine they looked. Clearly it was absolutely about sexual objectification, but it was less sort of gross than I expected. And I think that was all part of the sort of you know, the masculine pride in taking and in admiring these images. And what became clear was that really the images and women were just currency for men to give each other kudos, to big each other up, to form relationships, to you know, to grow their egos in this kind of performance with an audience of other men. So women with a currency. What seemed to be really important is men's kudos with each other, and this idea of polite misogyny, you know, also coming through. So it was a kind of grim set of data to look at, but it was very clear that you know, the ways in which that the ways in which these images were being used.
That's amazing, really, that, well, even the fact that there are websites devoted to this kind of thing, but what you're really bringing out there is fascinating. I think that the sense of the homosocial, and this is about bonds between men being created around that kind of pivot point of misogyny, polite misogyny, as your phrase, and really kind of draws on Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's work, the American academic sort of writing in the 80s, where she talked about that concept of the homosocial as kind of men, kind of, males using the female, using the woman as a kind of pivot point she conceptualizes a metaphor of a triangle where you've got a woman at one point in the triangle, and then there's two men at the other points in the triangle, and the key relationship is between the two men in a sort of homosocial and patriarchal society. And yet the third bit of the triangle is important because she kind of is a sort of a conduit for creating a glue, creating some, we can have men can have conversations about the women in order to bond. And that really comes out really strongly if we have images of women, the kind of the upskirting of women, they're just being used as an object for men to talk about and men to kind of create those bonds and relationships. Even interesting that they're sort of using that term, or nice shots, sir. that kind of, it's like doffing your cap to somebody,
Exactly, yeah.
it
Almost
just
kind of slightly old-fashioned, isn't it?
yeah.
And quite often young men using that kind of terminology of sir to each other. It's very kind of brings up ideas of the kind of hierarchy between men as well.
Very much, it really does. But there's sort of the gentlemanliness, there's sort of hierarchy and the structure of it. It's fascinating to see how just a new form, the very concept of upskirting, what people are able to do with having these tiny little mobile devices is created another way for that kind of misogyny and those patriarchal bonds to continue kind of forming. I mean, we've also seen, I guess, kind of just to touch on some other things that you talk about in your book, some of the horrific abuse of feminists that we've seen online. And, it's often about women who are speaking about women's rights in particular, although obviously any woman gets targeted online. And, it's happened to me personally, for example. But why do you think this happens, that that feminists in particular are targeted for online misogyny, or whatever we wish to call it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? Because it seems that any woman who puts her head above the parapet in ways that aren't about conforming to heteronormative femininity is at risk. And in fact, even if she is conforming to heteronormative femininity, she's also at risk of online abuse, largely from men, not only from men, but largely. So it's a really good question, to think about what is the function, what social or political function does this kind of online abuse of feminists serve. And there's a really interesting writer called Sia Pera, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who explores this idea, because many people have said this is an attempt to exclude women from public life. It's a way of getting women off the internet, not allowing women to engage with each other or with other men. And Sia Pera likens this to the witch hunts in the 16th and 17th century, when she says that this was about shifting society from feudalism to capitalism. And witch hunts, burning of witches, was to force women to conform to this new regime. And Sia Pera likens this online abuse of feminists and of women to that, because she says that we're currently in a move to advance techno-capitalism. So she's saying what we need is a materialist, not a cultural explanation. So a materialist explanation which focuses on how this online abuse excludes women from material resources. So she's less interested in the kind of cultural aspects, you know, and there's often, it's online abuse, I think, is often taken to be a kind of just a kind of cultural problem that if we can just re-educate a bit and close down some opportunities, we'll get rid of the problem. But she's saying this is actually quite a specific, this serves quite a specific function to stop women from having access to the resources needed in an advanced techno-capitalist world.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's
so sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ruth.
So I was going to say that she's less interested in how we engage with individual perpetrators, or what we do about individual perpetrators, or even very much about the platforms themselves, because, you know, their response to controlling this problem has been less than enthusiastic. And she says, she argues that we need to improve the activism amongst women, to increase the bonds between women, to resist this form, and to support women to engage in advanced techno-capitalism on an equal footing with men. So she's less interested in the kind of the solutions that are about tinkering with platforms or prosecuting individual men, and it's more about activism, allyship, solidarity between women and other allies.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. The way that, yeah, I mean, the DigitALL kind of theme for today for the International Women's Day 2023 absolutely maps onto that. It's not only about the cultural, but the very material lack that we have in being able to participate in the social world, in the economic world, if we don't have that kind of equity in relation to being able to use tech as in this kind of advancing capitalist society. It's fascinating, and it's making me think about Mary Beard's work, the academic who worked around ancient Rome, and she has a brilliant talk which people can Google, and also available as an article through the London Review of Books, where she talks about in ancient Rome, in the concept of oratory was that the man would kind of become a man by taking up his position in the public sphere and giving a speech. In this, you know, that was part of becoming the part of the civilized world, and the woman never had to do that. She was, well, it would have been extraordinary if a woman would do that, because she wasn't expected to be taking part in civic life and in public life in that way, and it was through speech and expression, and that had material then consequences. The material impact of that is, you know, how men and women were expected to behave in the social world and the kind of prestige they had and so forth. So we're seeing that from the Sia Pera, who you were just raising there, you know, where she's kind of bringing that into the current world and the very material consequences. It's not just about a bit of abuse here and there. It's a way of reducing women's access to economic resources, all sorts of resources, and you know, being able to participate.
Absolutely, yeah, and the resources mean power, of course.
You know,
yeah. And it's depressing, isn't it, to think that, yes, Mary Beard's talking about the classics and Roman society, and Sia Pera is talking about, you know, whichever century we're in, 21st century, the activity now. So it can be kind of overwhelming, can't it, to think, oh my God, we're seeing the same patterns throughout these centuries. Yeah. But there are attempts, aren't there, for to develop kind of non-patriarchal alternatives to the internet, and I think you've been seeing kind of activity around that popping up.
Yeah, I have been a little bit. It's absolutely not my area of expertise, but I've been reading some little bits and pieces about the way that people are imagining the internet moving in the future, and it's already moving in some respects. And the idea and the hope for it is that it will become decentralized. The idea for the internet, way back when, was that it would be quite a decentralized platform and kind of way of operating. But what we've seen is the big corporations and the big conglomerates kind of have taken control, and we kind of all work through them. So, we're working through Zoom right now. It's great. But we're working, we all kind of are familiar with using Microsoft, Google, kind of these are our daily things, but these are huge they sort of dominate the space and have taken things we all depend upon them. And the concept of what's being called Web3 is, my understanding, it's kind of giving back ownership and control to individuals in what it hopes to be as a more kind of democratized and decentralized way. I don't know enough about the tech behind all of that. It includes blockchain. Don't even ask me what that might be. Folk watching this will know a little bit more about that. And it also includes more nuanced use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which we're seeing already. Unfortunately, artificial intelligence, machine learning are learning and reproducing the same kind of sexist and racist kind of scripts that are already in our cultures. But I'm sure that there will be kind of more nuance and kind of ways that they will develop a little further. But the very concept of decentralization itself, again, was reminding me of an article from the feminist Jo Freeman back in the 70s, when women were trying to create areas that were not kind of hierarchical and were communal and cooperative. And Jo Freeman has this article called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Again, people can Google that, and it comes up pretty readily. It's not an academic article. It's kind of a short piece that was circulated quite a lot within the women's liberation movement as they tried to create non-patriarchal structures. What Freeman says in that, though, is that we often we almost inevitably end up with creating informal structures within those supposed non-structured worlds. And she talks about, so you get kind of elites forming in unspoken ways. So it would kind of be an in-group of people that has a little bit more power and a little bit more control. And of course, that tends to fall in the direction of who ordinarily has control within that society. So here would be men, for example, and kind of the sort of traditional power dynamics would come into the fore. So when I've been reading stuff around, just out of interest around this kind of Web3, I'm really curious to know how it could ever be that it's an objective space, that it is democratized fully without kind of re-scripting simply in another form the existing power relationships. It's going to be really challenging, and I think it's going to be interesting to see if it's possible. I'm not hugely hopeful personally.
Yeah, that sounds a bit bleak, doesn't it? What about the ways that feminists have used Twitter? Is there anything in the way that feminists have been using Twitter, do you think, that gives us hope for for creating more democratic spaces?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter's an interesting one. It's one specific platform that we've seen, like, it just got huge. It has increasing problems, obviously, with its recent takeover with Musk, and people have started coming off it, and we don't quite know where that's going yet. But what I've seen on Twitter is feminists really using that space in a way to network and to get things going and to find one another. They do get attacked on there. They get banned sometimes for, being a bit too feminist, probably. But often they can kind of come back. And what we've seen is, I mean, Twitter's one platform. There'll be other platforms that people and feminists are using. but you're able to mobilize and get the word out and get connected in ways that would otherwise be quite challenging. So technology has enabled us, enabled people to do that. It is an enabler. Of course, women in the women's liberation movement use newsletters and, you know, old-fashioned landline telephones and things like that. But you know, our methods can work just more quickly. So we have seen things like, you know, when I was on Twitter more than I am now, I watched kind of Caroline Criado Perez, for example, grow her audience, you know, from being, you know, an interesting kind of account and an interesting writer. She grew hugely to become, you know, an activist in her own right for kind of social change. And one of the things that people will have heard of around her work, you know, she's written a couple of books now, of course, around kind of data, as well as kind of women's exclusion from that data. But one of the campaigns that she got going, and it was mostly through Twitter, really, was to get a woman on a banknote in English currency, as the only woman was being kind of bumped off as they were making a new note. And that's one thing. It just sort of may seem small, but it's kind of about representation, and it was a big kind of cultural thing. And she actually got a lot of online abuse, and, you know, death and rape threats for wanting a woman on a banknote. It just shows how challenging that space is. And then in a very material way, there's just thinking of how another activist, Jean Hatchett, has mobilized women kind of across the country, where she does a kind of ride for murdered women, and she does this singly as herself, and she's collecting money for women's refuges and kind of services that offer support around domestic violence and abuse. But she's mobilized like different sets of women do this every year around the UK now as well. So Ride for Murdered Women, and they've raised, I think I looked just the other day, like £46,000 for women's refuges and services. And that all came from, that started on Twitter. Absolutely. I saw that happening. Jean Hatchett has a lot of followers. She's kind of an activist. She's an outspoken feminist. And what she's been able to do is raise that money for, you know, kind of galvanize other women, raise that money for services. And so there's like, you know, there's this hunger for a space, and Twitter for some time has been that space. And I think it still is continuing to be. It's just, so, you know, it can be used for good. The tech can be used for good.
Yeah. And I think you make me think about how I've seen over the years a real change in the public conversation about violence against women and girls. And this isn't only because of social media, of course, you know, it's because of a range of other things as well. But one thing I notice is that students who come to my classes, I've taught classes on gender violence and abuse for decades, and the students who start the classes now have such a higher level of knowledge and understanding in comparison to the students who started 20 years ago. And I think that must be partly because of their engagement with social media, so that they're learning about it. But I think that their understanding, their interpretation of it is much higher. 20, 30 years ago, I'd have to spend quite a lot of time convincing them how significant a problem this was, how many people were affected by it, how it was predominantly men being violent to women. I just don't need to do any of that any longer. They come to the class with that understanding already, with with whether they would name it or not, with broadly a feminist understanding of violence against women and girls, men's violence against women and girls. So I think that social media has really contributed in positive ways to the public conversation and understanding of gender-based violence as well.
That's really interesting that you've seen that within your own working life. And I guess that's just gives us that sense of, the ideas being more accessible, young women being able to read things, so they've read things before they've come in the classroom, or they've witnessed or experienced it, unfortunately, as well, either themselves. So they will be kind of clued up in terms of, you know, when I was younger, perhaps fortunate enough not to be aware of any of this kind of stuff. You know, you didn't have access to those ideas, and also your limited world also meant that you didn't see, you know, I'm fortunate that I didn't see any of that. I didn't have any of that, as far as I'm aware, in my kind of circle. So yeah, it kind of does open up that awareness, and it's fascinating to see that as you've kind of been teaching different cohorts over the year, as the new predominantly 18-year-olds come in, that level of awareness and shift gives you a little bit of a barometer of the sort of change, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a nice way of seeing it, and it gives me hope, you know, about how societies can change. I think the question that remains for me is whether and how young men are changing, because my sense is that young women, you know, are absolutely shifting the kind of the culture and the norms amongst young women, and I'm just not sure that young men are catching up. And I think that's, you know, that's where we need to be doing a lot of work to support young men to move away from the forms of masculinity that enable gender-based violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, what those young men are seeing, you know, we've got the Andrew Tate thing recently, of course, just kind of really, I don't want to use the word toxic masculinity, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? But, you know, the models of masculinity that are that can be out there, and I think for young men, that trying to find who they are, and kind of things like peer pressure, etc. It's really they need that support in basically, and kind of to be able to be themselves and not fall into those you know, those kind of damaging stereotypes that are just seem to be perpetuating themselves all of the time.
And I think what they absolutely need, as well as that, is men who will challenge the problematic masculinity, like you. I'm not a fan of the term toxic masculinity, but I'm always so disappointed in how rare it is for men as brothers, friends, fathers, colleagues, uncles, whatever, their failure to speak out when they hear problematic things from other men, when they hear sexism, misogyny, and they often don't speak out because they feel that their masculinity is at risk if they speak out. You know, this is what lots of research shows, that men tend not to speak out because they want to retain their masculine status. But we absolutely need generations of men to support other men and boys in exactly the way that you've said, to make good choices about the forms of masculinity that they adopt and support.
Otherwise we continue, it's back to that word homosocial again. A man feeling he needs to have some sort of mask of masculinity, some sort of concept of masculinity in order to be amongst other men and to be a man. And the sense of having different models, having different options out there, men speaking out, that other men can see and younger men can see. It is really what we desperately need more of, frankly. So I'm guessing we should be moving towards the end of our conversation, Ruth, so that folk aren't getting bored of us. I don't know. But we were sort of touching there on the kind of the positives that women have been able to bring about. Just, I know were a couple of examples that, you know, came out of my head that were that women have been able to use technology for good, and touched upon that, you know, being able to fight and kind of raise money for the violence against women and girls sector. And it just sort of made me think about bringing this back into the material world, and how that We have been, women mobilizing, women kind of networking, getting together, have been sort of a baseline of activism and support for women who have experienced violence, women who've been subjected to violence. And in the real world, or the material kind of physical world, all of those women-led organizations that we have, that were created by feminists and exist because feminists got together and were working together to fight misogyny. And so I'm thinking like, rape crisis centres, various women's refuges, and also more recently the campaigns that were kind of feminist led around making upskirting illegal, for example, a couple of years ago. And it's a sort of I guess just want to end with a sort of nod to the online and offline activism that women are engaging within and have engaged within throughout all of the kind of generations that we've been talking about, really.
I think that's really important, that sometimes we can think about activism online as just a conversation, as just a kind of cultural artifact, but it has, like you've suggested in the examples you've given, it has brought about real material change. And some research that was done, I think at the beginning of the 2000s, by two academics called Hutton and Weldon, was really important, because what it showed through a comparison of a number of countries, they were exploring the question, what is it that helps provide progressive policies and resources for women affected by men's violence? And the sole unifying factor, it wasn't having women in senior positions in Parliament, or having left or right-wing parties. It was having an autonomous women's movement. It was having an autonomous women's movement which led to progress around gender-based violence. And that was in the days before we were so involved with online life. But now that as I think you've said really clearly, there's this really close connection between online activism and offline activism, and that's what I think we need to celebrate, really, on a day like this, on International Women's Day, to sort of show that women working together with allies in solidarity across our differences can bring about real material change. So that I often think that for a woman experiencing violence in 2023, her experience might be similar to a woman back in the 1960s. Her experience of the violence might be similar, but the response that she gets, the support that she gets, the kind of consequences in her life, I think, are materially different because of the progress that women's activism has achieved. So that is worth celebrating on International Women's Day, I think.
Absolutely. And that just feels a wonderful, positive space to end on, to celebrate those women who have been involved in that and continue to be involved in those movements. So thank you so much, Ruth. I've so enjoyed this conversation today. Yeah.
It's been brilliant, Julie. Thank you. Talking to you always makes light bulbs shoot off in my mind, and new ideas and so on. So thank you very much.
Likewise. Fantastic. So I'll say goodbye for now, Ruth, and thanks once again.
Bye-bye.